Okay. Now, actually, before we get started, we're going to continue our discussion of the Civil War. Can you guys see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Um, we're going to continue. Oh, Elena, thank you for logging in. Hello.
Hello. Hello.
Um, we'll keep talking about the Civil War today. We've been talking about it for a while, the lead up to and then how it starts. And I think that is important to understand. I read something. Um, was it one of the readings was it the one we're going to look at today? So, I was looking for good readings, and something described it as the Civil War as the central event of American history. Um, yeah, maybe that was something else I looked at. The central event of American history, and it kind of is, or you could make that argument, um, because slavery is, if it's not, it doesn't have to be the topic that we talk about constantly, but it is in the background. Every picture you look at, there's a little bit of slavery in it. Um, every story you read from before the Civil War, certainly, you have in the background of that story is a world that includes slavery of Africans and African Americans. Um, so it's important to know. I mean, you can't, not that anybody really does, but you can't deny it. You can't pretend it didn't happen. You do have to face it. Now, it doesn't have to be the only thing we ever talk about, and it's not. But I thought it's good here for a few weeks to really focus on. And everybody knows the Civil War happened in the North and the South, and this and that, and maybe the battles and whatnot. But I think for us as citizens, people of America, and certainly for that GED test, high set test, whatever you may be studying for, um, and just to make sense of what you see on the news. This is important. So actually, Olawakimi, I wanted to, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot a little. Um, now you, Olawakimi, you are from Nigeria, right? Is that true? Olawakimi, are you there? Are you muted? Well, we can have that discussion and then we'll catch up.
Maybe she's
Um,
is not in the room.
yeah, maybe she stepped away. Okay.
Yeah. Mhm.
Um, okay. Well, I like to get perspectives from other,
Mhm.
outside people from outside this story, this American story. So I think
Right.
that'd be cool. Okay, so let's jump in. Let's review what we talked about last week. We kind of just did an overview of the Civil War. I just kind of talked through it. We got the North and the South. Of course, these are the two flags. We looked at the Confederacy, right? The Confederacy, or
Mhm.
the Confederate States, or the
Mhm.
CSA, they called themselves, as opposed to the USA. They were the Confederate States of America. The
Okay.
Southern states, um, are the Confederacy. That is where slavery was, and they broke away, or attempted. They said they were breaking away from the United States in order to protect their right to have slavery. Um, Now, that's not the only place, as we talked about. Not the only place with slavery. You have these green, and this map green, border states. Those are states that did have slavery, but did not leave the Union, did not secede. Okay. So we talked about some people. We talked a little bit about the strategy. One thing that's interesting, you have this, like these blue triangles. It says a blockade, Union blockade of ports. What does that mean?
Union block. Okay. Huh.
Well, the Union, let's take it one word at a time. The Union here refers to which side of the Civil War, the
The
North or the
South.
South?
The South.
Mhm.
Now the Union is the North.
It was it? Oh, okay. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
that's okay. No, yeah, you have the Union and the
The
Confederacy.
Confederate. Yeah, sorry.
The
I'm my bad.
it's not something we don't refer to ourselves as the Union anymore. And I don't really know where that word comes from then, but the Union is the United States, right? Like America, the
Right.
original country, the North in this case. So the
Mhm.
Union blockade of ports is like cities on the coast where ships come in and out and they trade, right? Ports. So what is if the Union blockaded the ports and look at
Mm.
where it is.
Yes.
So they stopped goods from
They
coming into the
stop.
South.
Yeah, okay, so they blocked it. It was a blockade. It's
Mhm.
they used their navy, um, which they had navy ships back then, and they would just go out kind of a couple, I don't know how far out, several miles, 100 miles out, and just kind of put up a line of ships, every so often, and stop trading ships from coming in and out. And if you do that, um, that keeps like people from say Savannah from shipping
Good
goods to
morning.
Charleston. Um, oh, good morning. Who just logged in? Who do we got here? Oh, Oluwakimi. Is that you then?
Hmm.
Yes.
Good, good, good. Oh yeah, thanks for logging in. So the Union blockade, that was one of the earliest strategies of the North was to blockade the South, and it did work. I think there were some naval battles. This isn't a big naval war between ships. Um, but that was especially in the early half of the Civil War. That was a big strategy. Okay, so that's on the map again. We talked about this. I'm not super concerned with what this shows. Um, Battle of Gettysburg, kind of the midway point of the war, 1863, where the war goes from 61 to 65. Talked about Civil War photography. Um, okay, and then it ends in April 1865. The South surrenders to the North. Okay. Oh, Jendaya, thank you for logging in there. Um, and the assassination of Lincoln by John Wilkes Booth. Okay, so then we talked about kind of backtracked the start of the war. The first, you wouldn't say it's a battle because it wasn't a battle. The first conflict, the first shots fired, certainly, was at Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. So in Charleston Harbor, Fort Sumter was in the middle. It was a Union fort, it was a federal, before the Civil War, it was a federal military fort, right? And so there were federal military, United States Army, Navy, I don't know what, um, people stationed there. Then the war breaks out. South Carolina is the first state um, to secede. And so, oh, Guisha, thank you for logging in. Um, good morning.
Good morning.
And so you have these Union troops, Northern troops, American troops at this fort down in, let's look at the map again, in Charleston, South Carolina, way down in the middle of the South, right? Surrounded by what's now enemy territory, although they wouldn't, the North. Abraham Lincoln never really said, okay, this is enemy territory. He always said it was still part of America. But they're surrounded by South Carolina.
Mm.
Lincoln says, well, we're not going to send troops. We're not going to send guns. We're just resupplying with food and water. We're resupplying this fort. South Carolina and the South said, no way, we're not going to let you do that. And they bombarded for 3 days. They shot cannons at
Mm.
this fort from all these other forts around Charleston Harbor. That was, and I don't believe that the people in Fort Sumter ever fought back. I don't think they did. If they did, it wasn't much. So it wasn't really a battle. Some people say the Battle of Fort Sumter, some people don't. It was the first conflict, the first shots fired between the two sides. It's the start of the Civil War. Once you have that,
Hello.
Hey, Jendai, good morning.
Sorry,
Once
I'm
you,
late.
that's okay. I'm just reviewing what we talked about last week right now. So, do I have a better map? Do I have? Yeah, okay. So we looked at this map, I think. The deep south, the dark gray, was the first 7 states to secede. They went with South Carolina, but the top of the South, I guess, the light gray, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, did not at first secede. They first at first when the other 7 states did, those 4 said, well, we're not ready to do that yet. That seems a little extreme. Once Fort Sumter happens and you have the 2 sides fighting, those 4 states, the upper South, then says, okay, we're in with the South. We're ready to secede. So then you have 11 states seceding from the Union. Not that important, but it is interesting to know that there's 4 states that weren't on board with the secession, leaving the country, until Fort Sumter happens. And then they jump on board. They say, okay, we're with the South. And that's what they do. Okay. Now, what we're going to talk about today is the Emancipation Proclamation. Important thing, kind of confusing the way it unfolds. If you ever talk about Abraham Lincoln, you're going to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. When you talk about the Civil War, you're going to talk about this. Now, the 2 words, Emancipation Proclamation, they're big words. What does to emancipate mean?
Emancipate.
I don't
Do
really even,
something?
yeah, I don't really even think, I can't think of any like root words,
Mm.
but if you are emancipated,
You participate with something?
no, not to participate.
Emancipation basically means you are no longer under enslavement. It could mean you're no longer under the rules of engagement for an age eligibility. Emancipation can mean a few different things. So it's like, say you are a 15-year-old young lady, you have a child, you thereby are emancipated under law as an adult, an emancipated adult, because you have a child, you have to take care of someone else. If you are a slave and you are emancipated, you are free from the owner's ownership, essentially.
Yeah, okay. So to emancipate basically means to set free.
Mm-hmm.
Today, you're right. With this, today, when you hear it, you hear about legal things. Teenagers sometimes can become, through the court system, become emancipated from their parents. Like if a young girl is going to have a baby, or if you have, maybe sometimes there's abusive parents, and if the child, they're not going to do it to a 10-year-old, but if you're 15, 16, 17, and you're not yet 18, legally an adult, you can basically sue you. I'm no lawyer, I don't know, but basically sue your parents, and through court, you can become emancipated, basically set free of your parents.
Yeah, that's true.
Like if, like in an abuse situation kind of thing. I'm not, I don't know, but that's kind of the meaning of emancipation. That's when you hear it today. But basically it means to be set free. So if Lincoln emancipated the slaves, he's setting the slaves free. Okay, that's easy to understand. A proclamation just means he proclaimed it. He said it. This was something that was said. Okay, that was announced is a good word. Okay, so it's just an announcement. He's announcing that the slaves are free. Okay, so we're going to do a reading. There's a couple of parts to it. This is kind of an introduction. Slavery in the Civil War. These are things we've talked about. Lincoln's dilemma, because the Emancipation Proclamation, basically it freed the slaves. We'll talk about, did it really free the slaves? And he didn't do it just to be a nice guy. He did it, Lincoln, the president is the commander in chief, the leader of the military, right? He did it strategically. It was for a purpose to help them win the Civil War. Okay, he didn't just do it to be nice. They felt that it was going to serve a purpose, so we're going to talk about that. there's a couple of parts, and then we look at the Emancipation Proclamation, interpreting the proclamation, significance of the proclamation. So if we can get through this in the next 40 minutes, there's a good bit of information here, but it'll help us think through this kind of complicated topic of the Emancipation Proclamation in the Civil War. But here's the big picture of the Emancipation Proclamation. It comes halfway. They didn't know it was halfway. Of course, they had no idea when the war was going to end, but it comes basically at the halfway point of the Civil War, 2 years in. And he wrote it in September of 1862, saying that it will take effect on January 1st, 1863. So he wrote it in September. He says this will take effect in January 1st. So he kind of like gave a warning to the South. And what it says is on January 1st, he wrote this and proclaimed it in September. He said on January 1st, slaves that are in areas of rebellion is the phrase he used. Slaves that are in areas of rebellion will be free. Okay. So what that means is slaves in the South or areas that are in the South that don't belong to the Union will be set free. It's kind of a warning. It's kind of a threat. So we're going to talk about that and exactly how that means. It served a couple different purposes. What we're going to look at is it did not set free. Let's look at the map. It did not set free the slaves that are actually living in the North, in the border states, right? The border states are states that have slavery but did not leave the Union. Those slaves are still slaves, right? Lincoln could have freed those slaves. He could have said slavery is over in the North, abolished, but he didn't do that. What he does with the Emancipation Proclamation, he doesn't set the slaves free. He doesn't end slavery, does not end slavery. He says that he ends slavery in areas of rebellion, which, you could argue that doesn't do much at all because the South doesn't care what Abraham Lincoln says. They don't think he's their president anymore. Okay, so let's jump in. We'll take turns. If you don't want to read today, that's okay. Just say so. But we'll talk our way through it. So the first section is slavery and the Civil War. I'll get us started. Washington, D.C., summer 1862. The Civil War had been going on for over a year, and it was not going well for Abraham Lincoln. 11 of the 15 southern states where slavery was legal had formed the Confederate States of America and were waging a war to break free from the United States. Lincoln was determined that the nation was not going to fall apart on his watch. When war broke out a year earlier, general opinion was that it would only take the United States a few weeks to suppress the rebellion. Because that's what this is really from the South. It's a rebellion. They're rebelling. So that's how they viewed it. Instead, during the first year of the conflict, the Confederate Army had won the majority of important battles. It was becoming more and more apparent that the Civil War was going to be a long and bloody conflict. Oluwakemi, could you read paragraph 6 for us?
Ironically, when Lincoln became president, he had no intention of abolishing slavery, though he personally despised slavery and had won the presidency on an anti-slavery platform. He would gladly have given up any chance of ending slavery in the South if it meant that the Confederate States will rejoin the United States.
Okay, thank you. So to abolish and abolition, we hear about abolitionists were people who wanted to abolish slavery. What does it mean to abolish slavery?
To abolish means to remove it.
To remove, to bring an end to, right? To end slavery. You can talk about abolish doesn't have to mean slavery. It can mean anything. You can mean abolish whatever, to bring something to an end.
Actually, I actually learned that while I was studying social studies right now. That's what I learned.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it abolished some. I mean, we only hear about it. The most often we hear about it is the abolition of abolishing of slavery, but
Frederick
the
Frederick Douglass. He's the one who was
mm,
a runaway slave, and that's who I was learning about. Him, Harriet Tubman. She ran up, and Harriet Tubman. She ran away from the slavery under from the Underground Railroad because
mm,
she wanted to be a runaway slave, and she also along with Frederick Douglass. They stopped slavery.
they played a big part. Yeah, they were big abolitionists, right? Abolitionists at that time were people who wanted to abolish slavery. Um, so yeah, abolitionists were they were when you talk about abolitionists, you're going to talk about Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass for sure. So Lincoln, there's a famous quote. It'd be interesting if it was in here. Um, I don't know exactly the context when Lincoln said it, but he said at some point, maybe it was a letter to somebody. He said, if I could, his top priority was to win the Civil War, bring the southern states back in and be a peaceful nation, a united nation again, right? And this paragraph here says he personally was against slavery, but his goal was not to end slavery. His goal was to bring the country back together. And a famous quote, he says something, I forget exactly how it goes, but he says, if I could end the war by ending slavery, I would do that. If I could end the war by not ending slavery, or no, he says by freeing the slaves. If I could end the war by freeing the slaves, I would do so. If I could end the war by not freeing the slaves, I would do that. If I could end the war by freeing some slaves and not freeing other slaves, I would do that. So really and that's a pretty famous Abraham Lincoln quote, which shows his top priority as president of the United States. He viewed it as his job. He's been handed this country, right? It's sacred duty um, as president to keep this country together. Uh, and he views it as his duty to bring it back. Um, Slavery, had been a problem since the beginning of the country in the 1770s, 1780s. Um, Lincoln's top priority was not to end slavery; it was to win the war and thus bring the South peacefully back into the country. Um, okay, so that's what this says here. Jendaya, could you read paragraph 7?
In Lincoln's first inaugurational address in 1861, he told the Confederates that I have no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. But Lincoln's reassurance fell on deaf ears. The states of the CSA were not going to backtrack on their bid for independence.
Okay, so that's in his inaugural address in 1861. His when he's inaugurated, becomes president. He says right then and there in his speech that uh, I have no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with slavery. I don't believe that I have a lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. So he says, I won't be messing with taking away your slavery. But the South doesn't really care. Right? Maybe they don't trust them. I don't know.
Mm.
Okay. So here we are. Um, the Civil War has broken out. Monique, could you read paragraph 8?
With no hope of bringing the South back into the United States by protecting slavery, Lincoln had a new dilemma. His own political party, the Republicans, had formed around their opposition to slavery. Many of the more radical politicians in the party saw the secession of the South as the best opportunity to abolish slavery once and for all. As the U.S. war dead piled up, more and more Northerns began to push Lincoln to punish the state that had succeeded by making abo- abolition a major goal of the war.
Making abolition.
Abolition, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So people did want to end slavery, okay, especially people in the North. They viewed it as morally wrong, which I I understand that viewpoint. And they said, okay, with the South gone, okay, so the two houses of Congress, right? You have the House of Representatives and the Senate. The seats where the Southern senators or the Southern representatives are supposed to sit are empty. So when they go to pass a law, and Congress is still doing its business, when they go to pass a law and they look over at South Carolina or Georgia or where Mississippi should be sitting or where Texas should be sitting, those chairs are empty. They're not voting. So they say, okay, with no Southern votes happening at all in Congress, let's pass a law that outlaws slavery. Nobody's going to vote against it because the Southern senators are off, saying that they're part of a different country now. So Northerners, it says Northerners began to push Lincoln to punish, also you can view it as punishing, the states that had seceded and causing this terrible war. Number 9, the problem with abolishing slavery, however, was that there were still 4 slave states that had not seceded from the United States: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Lincoln feared that if he advocated emancipation, pushed for emancipation, he would provoke those states into joining the Confederacy, making the war even more difficult to win. If the border states, of the border states, Maryland was particularly worrisome because the U.S. Capitol at Washington, D.C. sat on its border with Virginia. If Maryland decided to join the Confederacy, Washington, D.C. would be completely surrounded by enemy territory. Okay, that's a great point. So if he were to end slavery, which lots of people in the North want, okay, great. That's going to it could potentially anger the border states of, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Maryland that have slavery but didn't secede. They may say, hey, you know what, if you're going to take our slavery away, we are going to go with the South, right? They may just say, okay, we're doing it. Also, if that were to happen, you've got, let's see if we can get a closer map of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is not part of a state. It is between the states. It's wedged between the states of Virginia and Maryland. Okay, Washington, D.C. is a separate kind of entity. Its land was given, I think, by the state of Maryland because it's obviously on the Maryland side of the river. But it does not belong to a state. It is not part of a state. If you live in Washington, D.C., you don't live in a state in the United States. But as you can see, it's surrounded by West Virginia. It's like West Virginia, or Virginia rather, Virginia is literally right across the river from Washington, D.C. And if Maryland, now that was too much, my computer, oh, it's getting slow on me. If Maryland were to join the Confederacy, then Washington, D.C. is literally surrounded by the South, right? Which is not what you want for any city, let alone your nation's capital. Kind of make you nervous. I don't know how they did. They fought a war.
And that was the nation's capital at that time?
Yeah. Washington,
Okay.
D.C. was basically from right at the beginning with George Washington, they started planning it. Now, George Washington never lived there, but I think John Adams did, the second president. So yeah, right from the very beginning, they started planning Washington, D.C. Now, Washington, D.C. did not exist.
Okay.
when George Washington was president, I think he went and they had the nation's capital, I think in New York City. It bounced between like New York City, Philadelphia.
In Washington.
Well, there
Right.
was no Washington. So they
Oh,
said,
okay. Right. Right.
we need a city just devoted to being the
Hmm.
nation's capital.
Yeah, I knew it
Um,
bounced around between New York and Philly,
yeah.
and so I didn't know that at that time. Okay.
And so, yeah, so Washington, D.C. is a planned city. They made the city just right out of thin air.
Okay.
And it's actually, they say swampland, so it is pretty swampy. Um,
Hmm.
and you can see, it's cool to see old pictures of like the Capitol building being built and all that stuff. But they fought a civil war
Hmm.
with like literally the enemy territory, if you call it enemy territory,
Right next door.
is across the river. Like you could see it, like it's just across the river. And the Confederacy set up they set up their capital in Richmond. Let's see,
Virginia.
Richmond, Virginia,
Hmm.
which is 100
Yeah.
miles away.
Oh, that's funny.
Okay, so like that'd be problematic. So anyway, so back to our reading. They're worried that if Lincoln really does end slavery, you're going to anger the border states, and that includes Maryland, and then you're going to have your nation's capital surrounded by the country you're fighting in a war. If again, if you view it as another country, which Lincoln never viewed it as another country. He
Right.
never accepted that. He always said areas of rebellion. But that's something to take into consideration. We can't make those border states angry, because if we lose Maryland, then Washington, D.C. is in trouble.
Right.
Um, uh, Elena, do you want to read today?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Why don't you read paragraph 10?
Okay. Even though Lincoln did not intend to abolish slavery when the war began, circumstances changed rapidly. Enslaved people in the South chose owners were waging war to make sure slavery endured. endured. Immediately understood the conflict as a war to end slavery. When Northern forces invaded the South, black men and women escaped from bondage and ran to U.S. Army lines, seeing the soldiers as liberators.
Okay. So um, there, we look at the maps of the North and the South, and you think, okay, well, the North is the North and the South is the South. But as we've seen, let me see if I can get up to my map here of the battles. Uh, Almost all, the vast majority of the fighting happens in the South. Well, if they have a battle and the North takes over a town, then for a little while anyway, that town, is controlled by those Northern soldiers. So you do have areas of the South that the North is kind of taking control back. Just like today, if we have hand-to-hand combat, like in Afghanistan, you hear about the American forces taking a town, right? They have control, they have safety in that town. Well, that's happening in the South too. So not everywhere you go in the South is it 100% Confederacy, right? You have these battles, sometimes the North wins, and then that area, that town or area, kind of belongs to the North, right? So when that happens, let's go back to where we were. When that happens, the slaves in that area are gonna, if they can run away from their owners or whatever. It says black men and women escaped from bondage being slavery, and ran to U.S. Army lines, seeing the soldiers as liberators. So those Southern slaves are escaping and running to the Northern army that's there, and hoping to be safe with them. So it says at first the army had no idea what to do with this massive influx, this big group of people coming in, of formerly enslaved people, referring to them as contrabands. Contraband is something you're not allowed to have, right? Something that's illegal, since they were technically considered pieces of property. Some commanders found them irritating, all these slaves coming in, since it was difficult to feed and move so many extra civilians, and treated them abominably. What does that mean, abominably? If you're treated abominably.
Unfair?
Unfair, terribly, right? Others saw the exodus as a double bonus. Losing enslaved people not only demoralized white Southerners, or made them upset, took away their enthusiasm. Losing enslaved people not only demoralized white Southerners, it also deprived them of their labor force, meaning the South would soon run out of food and supplies. So all these, once the Northern Army is in the South, the slaves escape, some, and come for safety to be with the Northern Army, the Union Army, which does two things. It says a double bonus. First, it disheartens, it demoralizes, it saddens the South, because their slaves ran away. Secondly, it hurts the South because the slaves are doing a lot of the work on the farms to grow food and make things and manufacture things and do work. So that's going to hurt the South too. All their working, all their labor force is gone. So it says by mid 1862, over a year into the fighting, it had become clear that slavery was a major war issue. Lincoln, like several of his generals, began to see that committing the United States to abolishing slavery would only help its cause. In the summer of 1862, he began to hash out the details of the Emancipation Proclamation. So at the beginning of the war, Lincoln says, if I can end the war by freeing the slaves, I'll do that. If I can end the war by not freeing the slaves, I'll do that. If I can end the war by freeing some slaves and not freeing other slaves, I'll do that, right? He just wanted to end the war peacefully. By mid 1862, it's undeniable that this is a war about slavery. And the end of the war is going to have to include an end to slavery. It's just at that point, they're over a year in, bloody fighting. The South is doing pretty well in those early battles. It's clear that we can't end, if we win this war, we can't let the South keep slavery. We just can't in the North. So he starts hashing out details, thinking about how can we exactly go about doing this. Ruby, could you read paragraph 13?
Okay, thank you. Lincoln wrote the first draft of Emancipation Proclamation while staying with his family at the Soldiers' Home, a cottage on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., when they could get away from the heat of the city in summer. He presented the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet on July 22nd, 1862, and asked for their opinions.
Okay. So who is the president's cabinet? It says it presented the idea to his cabinet. It's not like a kitchen cabinet, right? He's not in there
No,
talking to
right.
his
They're his
kitchen.
advisors, right?
Yeah, the kitchen. It's the kitchen. The cabinet is, his closest group of advisors. Today, it's very specific. It's the specific list of people that we call the
Mhm.
president's cabinet. like all his secretaries of whatever, all those departments that are in the executive branch of the government, they make up his cabinet, right? His closest advisors. Back then it was very loose. It was very small. It was like half a dozen people. Today, I think the official list of cabinet members is like 30 people or something. But Lincoln was famous for having a very close-knit, hardworking group of advisors in his cabinet that didn't always get along. They didn't, these are people from a variety of viewpoints that Lincoln pulls together because he wants to get a variety of viewpoints. So he says, okay, here's what I'm thinking. Here's my draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. So it says they approved, but Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, suggested that they wait for a big military victory to issue the proclamation so that it wouldn't seem like a desperate measure. Yeah, that's an interesting view. The summer went poorly for the U.S. Army. Not until September 17th, 1862, did they win a decisive victory at the Battle of Antietam in Maryland. So they say, well, this is good. We like the idea, but if we do it now, it kind of seems desperate. So let's wait till we win a big victory, and then we'll seem strong, and it'll seem like a move of strength, not a move of weakness. Okay, so it says the Emancipation Proclamation, interpreting the proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation is not a beautifully written speech like Lincoln's Gettysburg Address or other speeches. It is a legal document. Lincoln was a lawyer before he entered government, and he knew the importance of making sure that laws and contracts were strong and had no flaws. Though the term proclamation seems to imply that Lincoln stood and proclaimed it somewhere, the Emancipation Proclamation was not a speech given by Lincoln. In essence, it was more like a decree. Lincoln wrote and signed it, and then copies of it were distributed for public notice. In many cases, U.S. Army officers read the document aloud to the formerly enslaved people who were accompanying the Army in the South, letting them know that from that point forward they were officially free. Newspapers also reprinted the text of the proclamation. Okay, so that's kind of what we said. It wasn't a speech that he made. It was a document that was signed, and it was passed as law and then distributed. And people did read it aloud. There's famous places, especially places in the South, where it was read publicly for the first time. In fact, there's lots of old trees down south that are called, I think there's more than one, called the Emancipation tree, because at this, it's a big tree now, but 100 and whatever years ago, you have 160 years ago, you have the Emancipation Proclamation being read in the South to slaves or former escaped slaves or whatnot. So there's, you could look up lots of famous places where that happened. But it wasn't a speech, it was more of a document. It's important to note that Lincoln specified that enslaved people would only be free in states which were, quote, then in rebellion against the United States, the states of the Confederacy. He even gave those states the opportunity to rejoin the Union before January 1st, 1863, to prevent the proclamation from going into effect. They declined. He said it came out in September. He wrote it and signed it in September, but it didn't take effect until January 1st. So he said, hey, if you come back, this won't apply to you because you won't be in rebellion against the United States. Well, nobody fell for that trick. None of the southern states took him up on that offer. Guisha, do you want to read paragraph 18 today?
Okay. The Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to enslaved people in the border state of Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland, which had not joined the Confederacy. Lincoln exempting the border state from the proclamation because he didn't want to tempt them into join the Confederacy.
Okay. Can you read paragraph 19 too? Just finish that up there.
Okay. Because the procl- proclamation was the temporary war measure, it later had to be codified into law with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Congress officially outlawed slavery when it passed the 13th amended, amendment in January 1865.
Okay, thank you. Good job. So to codify, it had to be codified into law, like to become a code, not like a code like a secret code, but a code like a law. Okay, so it had to be codified into law. Kind of a goofy word there. But it was only a temporary war measure. It did not officially totally end slavery, did not do that at all. But that would come with the 13th Amendment, which comes very, very near the end of the Civil War, 1865. Okay, still does not apply to the border states. They didn't want to tempt the border states into joining the Confederacy. Okay, significance of the proclamation. This is the end of our reading. The Emancipation Proclamation made emancipation an official part of the United States' military strategy, and that's how you should view the Emancipation Proclamation. He didn't do it because freeing the slaves was the right thing to do, although I'm sure Lincoln was happy about that part. It was a part of their military strategy. As the U.S. Army made its way across the South, it truly became an army of liberation. As enslaved people learned about the proclamation, they took an active role in freeing themselves from bondage, knowing that the army would defend them. Black men were accepted into the army to play their own part in ending slavery. So when you make this, when you make the Union Army at the end of 3 years into the war, 4 years into this war, when you make them an army of liberation, when you say, okay, your job everywhere you go, to your generals and soldiers and hundreds of thousands of soldiers, millions of soldiers, everywhere you go, you are freeing the slaves in that place. That's going to give those Union soldiers a little more purpose. If they're good people and they want to end slavery, then they're going to take heart. They're going to be enthusiastic. It's going to give them a little hope. It's going to give them a purpose, right? And it gives the slaves in the South hope and purpose. And whereas I'm sure they were always motivated to be free, now the thinking is, if I'm a slave, if I can get free, if I can escape, run away, and there had always been lots of runaway slaves. If I can successfully run away and get to the Union Army, maybe I hear about them, 50 miles or a couple of towns over, if I hear about the Union Army nearby, if I can get there, they will protect me. I'll be free. I'll stay with them. I don't know what the rest of my life looks like if they take me north or what, but if I can get to that army, they're going to protect me. They're going to support me. So that's different. That's new. It says, what's more, the Emancipation Proclamation made a promise. It promised that the United States was committed to ending slavery once and for all. It did not end slavery, but it said, okay, we're interested in this. It promised African Americans in the South that under no circumstances would they be returned to slavery if the United States won the war. Finally, it promised the Confederacy that there was no turning back the clock to before the war. The Emancipation Proclamation made the promise that the Civil War would change the United States forever. Okay. So if you ever hear anybody say Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation, if they say he ended slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation, that's not true. If they say he freed the slaves, well, that's partly true, right? It's partly true. And here's just a very fancy printing of it. It was printed in newspapers. I'm sure you could buy it. This is essentially a poster with artwork around it. People got themselves copies of the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a document, a legal document, a government document, but a very important one. So it's kind of complex, right? How we should view the Emancipation Proclamation. It was part of their war strategy. It was the right thing to do. It did not end slavery, but it was a step in that journey to ending slavery, right? Any questions? Anything unclear about this document?
No, not for
No,
me.
you did good job.
Okay, good. So as I said, I'm not big on the battles. We talked a little bit about the battle at Gettysburg. The generals we talked. We just said, okay, here's a couple of generals to know. I think how the war is fought is interesting, but I think history is always most interesting when you're talking about what was it like to be alive, to be an American at that point. I always say to read something in the newspaper. Now back then, you're reading about things in the newspaper like 2 weeks after they happen, right? It's not the next day, but what was it like to live at that time? And it must have been just like the 1820s, 30s, 1840s, 1850s, bloody Kansas. It must have been a crazy time to be an American, to live in certain places and have great change happening, have a lot of super drastic change happening all around you. And to be, if you were just a person in the South living your life, men were drafted in to fight the war, but so that even if you did not, if you lived in the South and you owned slaves or didn't own slaves, there's lots of poor, not all white people in the South owned slaves. I'm not even sure if the majority of white people in the South owned slaves. But if you're just a farmer in the South, maybe you don't own slaves. You don't care really if slavery comes or goes. But what was it like to be, to have these battles happening all around, all these across the South? Where's my map? Across the South, and this is just the big battles, right? There's lots of little, what you call skirmishes or little conflicts that happen. It was a crazy, dangerous.
Yeah.
Well,
And
when you
if
look how the Union blockaded the ports, you figure all those people, whether they did or didn't own slaves, they weren't getting the trade that they were used to. So they were going without.
right, yeah, no, life changed. There was nobody in the South, certainly nobody in the South was untouched by this conflict. There's big parts of the South where the Union forces never went to. I mean, there's no Civil War that I know of, no Civil War battles in Florida. There was some fighting out. They called this the West. Anything near the Mississippi, they called the West. Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas. I don't really know the history there. It's not the big war, the big battles, so the major battles don't happen out there. And yet you're still part of it, right? Even if your day-to-day life is unchanged, your trade still happens, you're still living in the Confederacy, and the Confederacy viewed itself as a new country. Again, they made themselves a new government. They elected a president. They had their own currency and money. I guess schools may have started teaching things differently. Life would have been different. And then, of course, there's the question of after the Civil War. I don't remember when we last discussed Reconstruction. I feel like it was not too long
That was in the
ago.
beginning.
Yeah, I think we're doing it backwards. Maybe next week we'll go back. Maybe I'll see if I can find Reconstruction from a little bit different angle. We won't do that same reading as we've done kind of recently, not
So
too
just
long
seeing
ago.
what life was like after
Yeah.
the proclamation.
Yeah, because Lincoln is assassinated, right?
Right.
Basically right at the end of the Civil War, a week after. But his goal was always to bring back the South. Let's get it back to, there's no going back to normal, but let's get back to normal and bring these states back together, bring the country back together. At the end of the war, Lincoln especially pushed for, we are not punishing the South. We're not, certainly not punishing the men who fought. They were allowed to keep their gun. If they had a horse, they were allowed to keep their horse, take it home, hook it up to a plow, and start farming. Let's get things back
To what it was.
back to what. Well, I mean, a new normal, certainly a new
Right.
normal, but get it back to life. That was Lincoln. Other people said, no, screw those people. They caused all this trouble for 4 years. 620,000 Americans died. Thousands and thousands more were injured. People men come back with limbs amputated. People were angry. Certainly people were angry. But Lincoln always said, we're not going to punish them. We're going to move forward. So yeah, and that's that must have been a terribly interesting time to live through. So any questions about the Civil War, any of this?
Not for me.
How about anybody who didn't, any of you guys who didn't grow up in America, go to American schools and hear this before? Anything that I didn't explain that doesn't seem to make sense?
I just want to say this part. Sorry I'm interrupting you, but I just wanted to say that people would find the Civil War interesting because they want to because it talks about slavery and they want to know, and the Civil War is a part of slavery. It talks a lot about slavery, and it could interest people who can find out who was a slave and who was not.
Mm-hmm.
That's my opinion.
Yeah, no, I mean, people, people are always talking. Like, there's some show. I don't know. You see it online sometimes where people find out their family history, right? And people are always on that show. I never watch it, but people are talking about, like, white people find out that they had slave owners in their past family, and African Americans who go on this show are finding out that their great grandfather was a slave in Georgia or something like that. So no, it's in our families, it's in our culture. You look on the news, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's still racial tension across America. We haven't solved this problem yet.
Yeah, we have to we have to really be careful. We have to really be careful. People, and there's another thing. We have to also know who came before us. One of the things I really think about what we have to do about when we study history. People say, well, you gotta study world history first because you want to know what happened. You live in the world. What's this? What's that? Well, that's your opinion to me. I think first, if you live in America, you got to study United States history because you need to know your own history before you know someone else's history around the world.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? Because you see, when you study American history, you get more information where you live, who came before you in your country that you live in.
Mm-hmm.
You got to do that first before you study something else, what happened in other countries before you were born.
Mm-hmm.
In other countries before you were born. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, definitely, I agree. I mean, there's fascinating stories. You can read about those ancient cultures, the Romans, ancient China, African civilizations, and there's great stories, there's cool, interesting civilizations and cultures. But if you're going to study one thing, and in this class we got to pick and choose what we do. I focus on American history because, yeah, it affects us much more directly.
You can also do geography. When you do geography, you want to know what's around the world, what happened around the world. Now, geography is not just about studying different countries. It's also learning about who was born in those different countries besides our country that we live in. Now, world history, that's okay. Learn about the old things that happened around the world and the wars. But I would suggest first to the American history because you need to know your own history. Then after that, you can learn other history of the world as well as geography. Well, geography again.
Yeah, yeah.
You want to do geography again? That's what they say. That's what all they say. That's all in movie.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. And I always, anytime we pull up a map or anything, we're talking about geography, so I try to pull that in. So the GED test and the high set test is very, very similar. The GED test is it's like 20 to 25% civics and government, right? So we try to talk about the way the government is structured and how it works. And it's like another 20 to 30% US history. Actually, it might be like even more, 40% US history. And then a little bit of economics, a little bit of social, a little bit of geography. So we try to just spice that in as much as possible. And, we can talk about
On the
the,
test, like what type of things about the U.S. branch of government are they requiring us to know?
well, there's almost always a graphic or something, right? So like a paragraph, a little reading, sometimes a longer reading, a map. There's something to refer to.
Oh, okay. That's what yeah, thank you.
Seldom do, I mean, I think there are some just straight up questions like,
Right.
who was the first president or whatever. But most of the time it relies heavily on, okay, here's a map or here's a reading or here's a
Find the
graph,
info, right.
and and it makes sense. So that's what we try to do. I don't, it doesn't matter if you know the date of the Emancipation Proclamation, but I try to give you the broad information so that you can get that specifics on the test and in life and plug it in, drop it into the right time period and say,
Area.
oh, I remember some general things about the Cold War or the Civil War. Because you're never going to learn, you're not going to learn it all. Certainly by the time you
Right.
want to take the GED test, you're not going to learn every person's name and date and battle and whatnot. So you learn the big themes and time periods. And some dates are important. I mean, I think it's important to know the Civil War happens in the 1860s, not the 1960s.
Right.
Some
That was a different time.
yeah, that's a different civil. Then you have the civil rights movement, and we'll look at that
Right.
sometime. Okay, so yeah, this is a long look at the Civil War. I think the lead up is important, and yeah, I'll find a way we can look at the aftermath of the Civil War, the Reconstruction period, which great things happen during, but also kind of settles back then into the status quo of racism and problems after several years. So we can talk about that next week.
Okay.
So yeah,
Thank you, Matt.
thanks for logging in, everybody. Enjoy some great spring weather again, and we'll talk to you next
Thank
week.
you.
Enjoy
All
your
right.
weekend. Have a
All
great
right.
day, guys.
After the call,
Bye.
have a good weekend, everybody.
All right,
Thank
see you,
you.
everybody.
That's all.